Okay, welcome to this special webinar. My name is Dr. Stephen Sussman, and I am a professor of public administration in the Andreas School of Business at Barry University in Miami, Florida, and co-founder of the Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research. Dr. Luis Fleischman and I, along with a team of dedicated colleagues, established the center as an outlet for the marketplace of ideas. The Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research is a nonpartisan public policy organization, a research center, and a think tank. We are a gathering of scholars, experts, and community stakeholders engaged in research and dialogue in an effort to create practical policy recommendations to current local, national, and international challenges. Therefore, the center encourages discussion and research from multiple perspectives. We believe that good policy is the result of reasonable dialogue and healthy debate. We believe in the marketplace of ideas. Thus, through publishing balanced articles and community engagement, the center aspires to provide a platform for critical thinking, analysis, and ideas to confront challenges that affect our world. Our core values of diversity, balance, and community define us and set us apart from other organizations. As an organization, we value diverse voices and views and see it as a means to create a healthy debate. Our objective is to be a community and place of gathering for academics, professionals, elected officials, decision makers, and civil society groups and leaders. Please visit our website at palmbeachdemocracy.org. On the site, you will find links to our past webinars. Recent webinars include a program on cryptocurrency and its connection to foreign policy, academic scholarship versus ideology, the intersection of national security and the Florida tech ecosystem, the analysis of the Middle East peace process, and many more. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. On our website, you will find a donation button. Through your generous donations, we are able to bring you important and timely programs and articles. Today, the Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research is thrilled to present another compelling webinar, Civic Responses to Russia's War on Ukraine, featuring Dr. Alexandra Hrycak, I hope I pronounced that correctly, professor of sociology at Reed College and past president of the American Association of Ukrainian Studies. Momentarily, Dr. Fleischman will do the formal introduction. We welcome your questions. You can write your question in the chat box. You can email me at stephen@palmbeachdemocracy.org, or when we are ready for questions, you can raise your hand either virtually or otherwise. I now welcome Dr. Fleischman, co-founder of the center.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is the third program that we have on Ukraine. The first one was with Mary Beth Long, a former Deputy Secretary of Defense. Then we had Dr. Ido Echt, who spoke about the current war from a military viewpoint. He made a military analysis. And here we have today Dr. Hrycak speaking about the civil society, right? Or I would say it's the civic response in Ukraine to this war, which is devastating. I think the topic is not going to go away. It doesn't look at this point that the war is going to end up anytime soon. So I believe we will continue to work on this topic for a while. Of course, we can work also on other topics, but this seems to be the central topic right now. I want to say that I met Dr. Hrycak for the first time in the late 1990s. She and my wife, Laura, who is now in the audience here, were MacArthur scholars. at that time, she was completing her doctorate at the University of Chicago. And when the crisis in Ukraine, when the war actually began, we were thinking, Laura and I were thinking about Alexandra. And then we thought that it was a good idea to bring her to speak to our center. I'm so glad that Alexandra kindly agreed to speak to us tonight. Let me give you a brief introduction of Dr. Hrycak. She's a professor of sociology at Reed College. Her research examines the cultural categories and narratives through which groups of citizens in post-Soviet countries articulate their understandings of nationhood and the conditions under which they are able to develop the capacity to act collectively. In other words, Dr. Hrycak has conducted a lot of research on civil society groups, how society organizes in the post-totalitarian era. She explores religious communities, women communities, cyber communities that have organized in the in the post-totalitarian era. She explores basically the nascent civil society in the post-totalitarian former Soviet Union and former Soviet satellites. So her most recent publication was a chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Gender in Central Eastern Europe and Eurasia. I'm sorry. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Hrycak. Dr. Hrycak, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be switching to my presentation now, if that's okay. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and also for the opportunity to speak to you about some ideas and some perspectives that Ukrainians have articulated. Let me see, I want to start my presentation. Hold on. Just a minute. I want to make sure this works. Here we go. Yes. So I will be speaking to you today about just a sort of overview, I would say, of civil society responses of ordinary citizens to the invasion, which was a very great shock to Ukrainians, although they had been at the highest levels working behind the scenes to prepare for this eventuality. For most Ukrainians, it was seen as something that was impossible to imagine. And yet what we see in the media, and if you look kind of beyond the media and social media, there are a really wide range of effective ways in which Ukrainians almost spontaneously seemed to respond to this invasion in ways that have really had a powerful impact. And I guess 2 months ago, it is when Russia invaded. And in that 2 months, as all of you know, there have been some huge losses and some terrible population crises that have resulted in around a quarter of Ukrainians fleeing and becoming refugees. So we're talking about a really massive migration of people, many of them to other countries. In particular, the gateway has been Poland. And from Poland, some people travel onwards. But what I guess we could find very surprising is that at the time of this invasion, we expected that Ukraine would have fallen by now. And although there was this panic that deservedly many people left their cities and towns, especially in the East, where there has been horrific shelling and a lot of attacks on civilians and on hospitals and schools and universities. Nevertheless, what we might find puzzling about this situation right now is that, in fact, Ukrainians have been remarkably resilient and have responded in ways that have kept their spirits very high, despite what you could call a very dire situation and very scary conditions, with some of my friends and colleagues reporting that they are under nightly shelling. And this has been going on for months. And so I hear over and over from many people in Ukraine that they are not afraid, that it's scary, but they're not demoralized, and that they feel a lot of hope. So this is the puzzle that I want to talk about right now. And the puzzle being that a country, a post-totalitarian country that started with very limited capacities for responding to any kind of crisis, as we saw, you could even say, after Chernobyl, which took place in Ukraine and did not, at least initially, bring forward a civic response. Over that time, we've seen Ukrainians really transformed, both culturally and I would say politically, into a nation that considers it into a nation of heroes, people who now view each other as heroes, and not just seeing heroes as like in the typical war narrative, a few military individuals, but actually genuinely people feeling as if they are all heroes and that they're all doing what they can in the face of this. So just to kind of give you an overview.
Alexandra,
yeah,
excuse me 1 second.
Sure.
Somebody has a TV, or, can you mute everyone since you are the host?
Okay, all right.
Can you do it? Because
Yes.
there are some interferences.
Yes, okay, yes, I
Mute
see.
everyone.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, Alexandra.
No, thank you.
If everyone can mute themselves, if you're not muted, that would work too.
Okay. Okay, and I admitted someone. So I muted everyone, and now I will continue. So I was just giving you a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of a kind of a really big transformation, not just in Ukrainians today, but that has happened over a longer period of 2 decades, and especially in the last 8 years since Russia first began invading Ukraine. Now, at the time of this invasion, there was an almost immediate outpouring of material aid, of donations of medicine in particular, but also of medical equipment and sometimes military equipment as well. These were led by large organizations as well as small informal networks. So it was really a very multi-level process. And in my particular city of Portland, Oregon, almost overnight, a group of people came together and organized an entire plane load of badly needed medicine for the front battle lines, containing all of the basic essentials that they knew the Ukrainian military often had shortages of, including things that they had become aware of through mutual communications over the last 8 years, were necessary in particular in the kinds of conditions of war that Russians have engaged in, which is dirty war, a war in which civilians are constantly being threatened, a war that is very violent, and that involves things like booby traps with grenades. So they sent all sorts of material from all over the world, every single nation in the world practically. And there were also many very effective anti-invasion protests. And I'd like to say that These acts served at least two purposes. On the one hand, Ukrainians knew that the country had a critical shortage of certain basic material necessities needed for the military, needed for the emerging refugee populations, and needed for cities that were living under siege, things like medicine. But on the other hand, people were also engaged in expressions of their citizenship and responses to what I would like to call the Russian narrative around this war, which in many regards views this war as not about Ukraine, and that views the war as and views Ukraine as not really a country, and views Ukrainians as not really a nation, and therefore really represents Ukrainians as what we would call, if we were Russians, brainwashed Russians. And as a result of this narrative, Russia was the chief promoter of this narrative. And as maybe some of you know, their president ridiculed Ukraine and said that it was not a real country, and also made a lot of inflammatory kinds of claims, but generally talked about NATO and Europe and the West, and about how the West had threatened Russia's very existence. So really the real victim, as the Russian media narratives and public narratives have focused on, the real victims of this war were Russians, not Ukrainians. And the real perpetrators of the war were actually people in the West who had victimized Russia itself and had dissolved Russia into many competing failed states, among which was Ukraine. And in that early period, we heard very belligerent statements from Putin himself, as well as the Russian state media, indicating that Russia would not stop in the face of this Western aggression until it had reconstituted the entire Soviet empire. And we saw a lot of shocked faces at that time. But during this time, there were also Ukrainian responses. And I wanted to start with one. I'm hoping this will work for your viewing, but we'll just see. This is an example of a very effective vehicle through which Ukrainians are reaching out both to each other and to Western audiences and allies to try to counter their own invisibility in this war. So let's see if this works. Okay, I'm gonna make this bigger. Can you guys see this? All right.
Лузі червона калина похилилася, чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася, а ми тую червону калину піднімемо, а ми нашу славну Україну, гей, гей, розвеселимо. Ой, у лузі червона калина похилилася, чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася, а ми тую червону калину піднімемо, а ми нашу славну Україну, гей, гей, розвеселимо. Ой, у лузі червона калина похилилася, чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася, а ми тую червону калину піднімемо, а ми нашу славну Україну, гей, гей, розвеселимо.
Stop share. Okay.
Usually bras fit
Whoops.
small.
Yes, so here you see in that video, which was made by a refugee from Ukraine who left the country after being a refugee from the initial invasion in 2014, in Lithuania, featuring a sort of narrative in which Ukrainians themselves are empowered citizens, in which Ukrainians themselves are rising up together collectively through their own efforts and challenging the an invasion through small and possibly individual and highly personal acts of solidarity. And of course, many of the brief shots were of protest actions that were held worldwide, in South America, across North America, in major cities across Western and Central Europe. And through those actions, Ukrainians countered their own invisibility and also challenged the notion that they themselves were being liberated by the Russians, as the Russian state claimed. Now, I just like to say that this is a response that may seem very normal when we watch it. It may seem very, you could say, of course people would have that response to an invasion. If Russia invaded the United States, wouldn't we do that as well? But I'd like to say that this is actually a very surprising kind of response, and many of the actions that people are engaging in over the last 8 years have been a response to this sort of neo-imperial narrative that Putin has been disseminating very, very relentlessly, and not just for the last 2 months, but that have barraged Ukrainians for almost 10 years, and that have gotten progressively more and more belligerent, and that constantly place this focus on Ukrainians not really mattering for their own sovereignty, and challenging that through volunteering for soup kitchens, food banks, working with refugees, enlisting in the military, civic engagement through grassroots social media work, reshaping Ukrainian national identity around new notions of inclusivity, and challenging Russian propaganda. Now, on the one hand, we in the West may see this as very normal, but in a post-totalitarian society, this is not actually something that you could bet on happening. And I'd like to just sort of spend a minute or two to sort of remind you that while Ukrainian responses can be seen sort of vis-a-vis Western civic engagement, it's really much more important for us to compare Ukrainian and Russian responses to the war, and also to similar kinds of crises. And if you do that, you'll see that in Russia, in contrast to Ukraine, there is almost at present no possibility, no structural or institutional foundations for these kinds of acts. It is illegal to call this a war. People are jailed for protesting against the war. People are prevented from speaking openly about their opinions out of fear for losing their jobs. Whereas in Ukraine, the response that I'd like to sort of leave you with is, there have been, several principal responses, but the one that I think has mattered the most to Ukrainians, it's important that people feel really like empowered when they raise funds for refugees or for the military or for people in need. But what I think really people feel super empowered by is that they are finally openly challenging the Russian propaganda to which they've been relentlessly subjected for decades. And I want to say that challenging Russian propaganda involves just a few kinds of, you could say, discursive moves in the war. And I think Ukrainians have been very effective in this, in these reframings, because you'll be recognizing some of these from Western media coverage. Unlike in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, which was a part of Ukraine illegally in 2014, and then started a Russian sort of separatist movement in eastern Ukraine that became very bloody. In that time, Western media had a very murky understanding of what was going on, and Ukrainian voices were not very often found in the Western media. There were some positive stories, but often focus was on how Ukrainians were potentially ultra-nationalist, or that they may have a very large neo-Nazi movement, all of which are Russian claims. Now, what I'd like to sort of leave you with is the idea that the fundamental frame that Ukrainians have been faced with in the media positions Russia as engaged in this fight for its imperial reconstitution under a new guise, and that they really very much challenge that, and that they want to reassert that the villains of this are not Russia, and they're also not NATO, that the villains are the Russian state and the Russian military. I'm sorry, that the villains are Russia. my apologies. Rather than the villain being the West, that the villain really is the Russian state, and in particular the Kremlin, that Russia and Russians are not the victims. And this has been very important for Ukrainians because of the denial of atrocities and claims that they were staged. And Ukrainians have been working really hard, especially on social media. And the thing that they most want people in the West to be aware of is that a lot of the reassertion of who the real victims of the war are involves recognizing that civilians are the constant focus of military invasion and have been suffering casualties, including among, of course, children and other civilians. They also, I want to just finish with this, that denial that this is a war has really been a major focus for Ukrainian engagement. In Ukraine, everyone is aware that the Russian media can only call this a special military operation. And so much of the civic response and the things that people are sharing with each other, and the thing that they are trying to work with Western audiences to understand, is the idea that the purpose of this war is the destruction of Ukraine itself, and it has nothing to do with NATO. That's really entirely sort of discursive move on the Russian part, because in fact the Russians are trying to reconstitute the Russian Empire. And when they say that Ukraine is not a real country, what they mean by that is that those are Russian lands that need to be reclaimed. And I finally want to say that finally, I'd like to finish by saying that there are huge obstacles to sustained voluntary activities in post-totalitarian countries. And in Ukraine, many of those were Soviet legacies that also treated Ukrainians as Nazis and as scoundrels, and did not provide sort of counter images to that. There was also a very strong East-West divide and a lot of clientelism, and people really shunned being involved in politics. But ever since 2013, Russia invading Ukraine has led to an entirely new civil society building rhetoric and an entirely new understanding of Ukrainians as European citizens who want to integrate with Europe, to develop European democratic institutions, and to part ways with the imperial states that are part of their past, and head towards a future in which Ukraine is a member of the world of nations, and also is a member of the European Union. I think I'll end there, and I'll just take questions now.
Thank you so much. Do you mind if I reclaim?
Go ahead, please do.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you. Luis, you were did you have a question? You were asked,
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll take the liberty of being the first one to ask the question, and then interesting what you're saying. You seem to say that civil society, in fact, begins to develop in the aftermath of the annexation of Crimea by the Russians. And that's exactly what I was thinking about asking you. Yanukovych, right? In the year 2004, he's basically forced out under the claim that he committed fraud, right? And that was the major Orange Revolution, the well-known as Orange Revolution.
Yeah.
And then in 2010, he is elected without claims to fraud.
Right.
Why, first of all, why the Ukrainians elected him? That's what is very interesting, knowing who he was. That's the first question.
Yeah.
The second question is, you spoke about the accusations against Ukraine that of Nazism or being associated with Nazis and so on and so forth.
Sure.
So one major concern is why all these monuments honoring former Nazis? Why all these monuments honoring Khmelnytsky? So I think some people actually believe that, to a certain extent, still you have this image that the Nazis were the saviors of the Ukrainians during World War II. And, this image of collaboration between the Ukrainians and the Nazis. Why don't they remove these monuments?
Well, I'll just say, like, those are two totally separate sets of issues.
Correct. Two separate, yes.
What are your priorities here? What's your priority?
Answer the first question and then the second, Alexandra.
Okay, so I mean, I think that Laura's dissertation supervisor, Chuck Tilley, made a very similar argument that wars are very powerful catalysts for national formation and for nation building. Now, I'm not making the argument at all, of course, and I assume that none of you think I'm making this argument, but I'd like to nevertheless restate it. Ukrainians existed before 2013 or 2014, and there were civil society groups, and there were very brave people who had challenged state authority and who were active, and there was a national independence movement. And in 1991, a majority of Ukrainians voted to become independent. And after that time, Russia and Ukraine and other countries signed agreements that they would honor each other's territorial sovereignty and integrity. So and this was a central aspect of when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. They were given over to Russia, but Russia promised never to invade Ukraine. So there are a lot of background institutional measures already in place in modern states that have to do with regulating interstate warfare. And for a long time, those were operating kind of through inertial processes. Now, the Ukrainian experience with Yanukovych is a complex one, because the Kremlin very heavily backed Yanukovych, and Yanukovych himself was and is over time increasingly important sort of kingpin in Eastern Ukraine among set of sort of clientelistic, almost criminal networks. And they had a lot more money than like the clean democratic reformer types. So they had a great advantage in terms of electoral and political success. And and it also helped that Russia, and since about 98 or 99, but certainly by 2000, had returned to Soviet practices of interference in the non-Russian areas, heavy interference, and had by that time also started various wars and had backed puppet states in several areas. And I won't be speaking about those, but everyone knew that these were going on. And so there were people in Ukraine who were concerned about this, but most Ukrainians were really engaged in economic survival. But in 2004, very unexpectedly, this pro-European candidate who was supported by university students and by small civil society groups, and who didn't really have powerful backers other than maybe one business tycoon, and was really backed by sort of middle-class people, went up against Yanukovych, who had all of this Kremlin money and all of these Kremlin advisors, and who ran a very dirty campaign, and who was also backed by someone who poisoned Yushchenko and tried to assassinate him with a pipe bomb second time. So there were repeated assassination attempts against Yushchenko. Well, all of this combined to make Yushchenko look better and better, and to make him kind of a national hero and a national martyr. And Yanukovych being associated with criminal networks, and then dramatically falsifying the election. I mean, on a level that was just, even by post-Soviet standards, egregious. I mean, they had like busloads of soldiers going from polling place to polling place, voting repeatedly. And then they also falsified the results so that, like, in Donetsk, which was his hometown, I think they had like a 101% turnout rate of people, of voters, you know, so this was like just completely mythical levels of corruption. And people, in response to that dramatic display of malfeasance, they rose up. And I think that that it helped that there were some civil society groups that had already started to form, but they were very small. And it was really very much like a moment where a sort of a movement of reformers started, but they didn't get very far. And a lot of Ukrainians remained very disengaged. So they went to these protests for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but then they went back to their normal life, and they were really shocked that, like, Ukraine didn't become a totally different country after the Orange Revolution. It was not revolutionary. And instead, it continued to be very riven by these conflicts, especially over Ukraine's geopolitical orientation. And the Kremlin increasingly backed more effective public relations services. And Paul Manafort helped to clean up Yanukovych's reputation. And he came to be seen as like a fine and upstanding young politician who was going to be something of almost like a technocrat or something like that, and who wasn't going to engage in stupid identity politics. Even though earlier he had made it very clear how pro-Russian he was, this time he actually was very moderate. He even said, like, he was for European integration. So people could vote for him and think, I'm voting for an alternative to my disappointment that the world did not completely transform because of the Orange Revolution. And that Ukraine was like a faltering democracy, but nevertheless, like, had a competitive, had a pluralistic media environment, had a lot of conversations going. People were starting to deal with the historical questions about the Nazis and about World War II. And a lot of that was rolling back in places like Russia. So he narrowly won with all that Kremlin could point in terms of resources to lower the vote of pro-European people and raise the vote of people who are pro-Russian. So that was a very close election. And I think a lot of it was sort of like what we see here, where, midterm elections, if there's a Republican presidential candidate who wins, and the midterm elections, they lose some of their representatives to, like, sort of democratic counterattack. So there was a little bit of this kind of a wave. Now, in terms of why Yanukovych then was elected, I mean, I honestly really think that it's money, and money goes very far in a place like Ukraine. He was very corrupt, and in fact, I would say that he left because he became so corrupt and so dictatorial and autocratic that he lost some of his followers, who were sort of like the lower level oligarchs and the other competing oligarchs, and created a little bit of a power vacuum there. But he was very, very deeply unpopular, and Ukraine is just too diverse to be represented by a pro-Russian president. And that's what he was. And he had finally, it was like the straw that broke the camel's back was when he failed to sign the European Membership Association agreement that he had promised to sign, and that was it. And the next thing you know, there was months and months and months of rising Euromaidan revolution, and ultimately Yanukovych fled, and the rest is history. Russia almost immediately counterattacked by invading. Now, with respect to the Nazi narrative, so I personally think that the biggest collaborator in Eastern Europe is the Soviet state. The Soviet state was a collaborator on an institutional state level with the Nazi government for 2 years, and they were in cahoots. And this was the collaboration story. I mean, a lot of the things that led to untold suffering in Eastern Europe were the result of the Soviet Union initially aiding fascism, extending its reach in Europe, and collaborating with them. And so I think the fact that there were these underground movements that suddenly came to be seen as like the main collaboration story, that's every bit of propaganda to be effective has to have some truth. There were definitely underground fighters who had anti-Semitic beliefs, who were part of the Ukrainian underground, but by no means were they ever Nazis. I mean, they were their own kind of underground. They were guerrilla revolutionaries at a time when the Soviet Union and Germany had both invaded them repeatedly, and they were never aligned clearly with any particular other state because they were trying for a Ukrainian independent nation. I have no problem calling them fascist, but you must remember that fascism is a state-level institutional designation. So we tend to become like, oh, that person is fascist because she like cut me off in traffic. You know, like we start to call fascism things that fascism is not made to be. Like, I don't like you, you're fascist, is something that maybe some of your children have told you. But fascism is a characteristic of an institution, a political system. Ukrainians might have, if they had the opportunity to have an independent country in 1945, they might well have built a fascist government. However, in the past, they had never gotten very far. And when they did try to establish Ukrainian national sovereignty, they had never, there was never a primary emphasis on anything like a single party. And in fact, there were multiple parties. And after Ukrainian independence, Ukraine has remained a multi-party, very flawed democracy. The parties are often, fly by night. They come and go. There's no like sort of institutional continuity really. So they don't really have a party system, but they do have party competition, and which is something that is not true in Russia and not true in some of the other post-Soviet countries. So I'd like to just say that, like, if we really want to have a big sort of interrogation of who the Nazis were, I think in Ukraine they have started that conversation. There have been a lot more continuities with Soviet historiography in Russia. I have been shocked by how little Russian historical consciousness has changed, how little Russian historical consciousness and political claims have changed in the last 30 or 40 years. People have tried to move the dial, but those people are then like bang, bang down. They're prevented from opposing the institutional narratives, which are very consistent with Soviet narratives. And under those Soviet narratives, throughout the Soviet Union, the thing that was promoted was that Ukrainians were little Russians, or they were Nazis, and Nazis, or they were Banderivtsi. And I just want to say, I'm like, my family is from on my father's side. My mother is not Ukrainian, but my father's side, they were from Western Ukraine. I didn't grow up worshiping Bandera or any of those people. And then in the institutions in the diaspora, we didn't venerate them. We engaged in like normal diaspora activities around human rights, and the other things that are part of the institutions of the United Nations were very important to us. It's been for Ukraine the main definer of national institutions. It doesn't have a pre-existing statehood to which, like Russia, it would look to for historical inspiration. It primarily aligns with trying to understand itself within the United Nations framework. And that has created certain kinds of anchorings for pluralism. And so Ukrainians are having fights over Nazism, but for the most part, people in Ukraine really think that the idea that they are somehow a Nazi state is flies in the face of the fact that they elected a Jewish president with very great popularity and with no corruption involved and no falsification claims at all. Ukrainians all, like nationwide, also supported his party. So, and he's remarkably popular, and I do not hear voices of anti-Semitism, but there were a lot of hyper-nationalists and anti-Semites who were funded by the Kremlin in 2013 and 2012. And it's very much part of the Soviet toolkit to engage in that kind of activity. And they have quieted down a lot since the Kremlin was forced to sort of cede some of that ground.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. Thank you so much. Thanks for clarifying this.
Another question.
Yes.
Yes.
No, I was going to ask, Joel, can you
Joel
unmute
has a
yourself?
question.
Joel Channing, one of our, you have to unmute yourself, or do I unmute him? Let's see. Joel, here, let's see if I can unmute him. No, you can unmute yourself, Joel.
He's now unmuted.
Nadezhda joined us.
No? Oh, sorry.
No, he's not. No,
Huh.
oh, here, ask to unmute. There you go. So unmute.
All right. Am I
Oh,
here?
there you go. Oh, you're
Yes, you
there.
are fine.
Okay.
Hi. I really enjoyed everything you had to say. One thing that I thought that I knew was that the president of Ukraine actually was fairly corrupt, and that he was involved with Biden's son at one point. And I don't wonder if you know anything about that.
I can't really say that I can speak to that. Those were actually kind of claims that have been backed by the Kremlin itself through its various troll factories and through sort of like paid bloggers. Biden's son is a non-entity in Ukraine.
Well, he has a very well documented notebook of things that, oh, gee, what did I do?
No, you're
we
still
can
there,
still hear
Joel.
you.
We can still hear you, Joel.
We can still hear you just fine.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Anyway, I don't really know for sure. I'm sorry. But I have one other question.
Sure.
When you were talking, you mentioned Paul Manafort, if I heard you correctly.
I did, yes.
And in what context was that?
Paul Manafort was hired to polish Yanukovych's image to turn him into a viable presidential candidate.
Okay.
He was the campaign manager.
He was the campaign manager for Trump.
Right.
Yeah.
later. But prior to that, he spent a very long time on the bankroll of the most corrupt president of Ukraine, Yanukovych. And he vastly enriched himself, and he was ultimately convicted of not declaring that he was a foreign agent. So he was a foreign agent during that time, and also represented Russians.
All right. And I just want to say you speak beautifully and clearly, and I really enjoyed listening to you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? Any other? Oh, there you go, Steve.
Sure, I
Okay,
have a
Steve.
question.
Yeah.
I have a question about Ukrainian identity and de-Russification. I was last in Ukraine in early November, and I visited Kyiv and Odessa. And I speak Russian, and these are two predominantly Russian-speaking countries, Russian-speaking cities. We are now in this crisis, and I'm wondering if this is going to accelerate de-Russification. We have Zelensky, who is a native Russian speaker from southeastern Ukraine, and who's Jewish, who's not ethnically Ukrainian. And a couple of weeks ago, he continues to do speeches in Ukrainian, but then switches to Russian as he speaks to Russia, basically. And in one of the videos, he said basically how they're accelerating de-Russification, and that the Russian language is now going to be associated with horrible crimes. And I lived in Georgia, in Tbilisi, for a bit, where I studied Russian. And there, de-Russification is very much on its way. Anyone my age, I'm 32, or younger, chooses English, and anyone who's my age or older still speaks Russian. Obviously, Ukraine is not like the Baltic states, not like the Caucasus, not like Central Asia. It's part of the three Slavic sisters, if you will, part of the Ruski Mir, or if that's what Vladimir Putin wants.
Yeah, that's what Vladimir Putin claims.
Well,
they don't see
yeah.
themselves that way.
Where do we see the future of the Russian language in Ukraine and as part of Ukrainian identity?
So in Ukrainian civil society, there has been a lot of work done to recognize that Ukrainian citizens can speak Russian too, and that it's okay, and that there are complex historical reasons why a lot of Ukrainians were prevented from learning their native language. And people have even told me how painful it was for them to realize that they couldn't speak their mother tongue. And they also felt at the same time that it would be really hard and artificial for them to switch languages. I have seen a really dramatic increase in the use of Ukrainian over the time that I've been visiting Ukraine as a scholar. And I want to say there has just been also dramatic change in sort of how Ukrainian is perceived because of things like the music industry and the development of interesting literature and cultural developments that make people want to read or learn about Ukrainian events. And also it makes a difference that for the last few years, children in schools are learning in Ukrainian, but prior to that, for a very long time, and throughout the eastern areas that are now under Russian occupation, institutional forces largely prevented that from happening in the cities. I personally know of people who grew up in smaller towns and villages in those areas who speak Ukrainian, and in some cases really are very attached to their Ukrainian identity, even though those lands are now occupied, and who are very pained by this. And yet a lot of the time do speak Russian with their relatives because their relatives grew up in different times, or in some cases, I mean, hundreds of thousands of Russians were brought in as kind of colonists into Ukraine in the Soviet era. And they have, some of them left to go back to Russia, but a lot of them intermarried. And this was initially seen as something that was dooming Ukraine to irrelevance, and that would result over time in the disappearance of Ukraine, something that people have shared with me. But on the other side, it also means that since the last 20 years or 25 years, there are all of these half Russian, half Ukrainian kids who grew up thinking, yeah, I mean, I have relatives in Russia, but I mean, I grew up here and Ukraine is my country, because it was just a fait accompli. They grew up in Ukraine and this was their country. And if they needed to get a passport, the passport said Ukraine on it. And I think that just some of the regular institutions of statehood powerfully changed national identity to make it potentially important. But for it to really become salient, this drama over which direction Ukraine should go, and the obvious coercion and violence by Russia, which previously was seen as very benign by many Ukrainians, this has just been what you could call a really great act of moral injury. And I think for many people, it was initially painful, but for a lot of people, it has actually changed how they feel about their national identity in irreversible ways. And I think it's behind why Ukraine is still fighting this invasion. People feel strongly that they are not Russia.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions that people have? I mean, I know that.
I'm talking and I was muted. I'm sorry. I apologize. I have a question.
Mhm.
That we've talked about. You've talked about the Nazis, the Jewish president, so on and so forth. But I've seen over the last since the war started, Israel getting involved in the refugee situation, the refugee crisis. Yet, from what I read in the Israeli press and the American press, Israel hasn't really taken any sort of side except from the refugee perspective. Can you comment on that? And
yes. Ukrainians have been very disappointed about this. There is a diaspora in Ukraine, and I believe that the welcoming of refugees a lot of the time is aided by diaspora networks, and there have been activists there. I have a former student who's in Israel and who is a very proud Ukrainian patriot who grew up in Ukraine, and she's been doing a lot there locally. I think the state of Israel, under its current sort of more right-leaning guise, I think that there are some ways in which there are ideological affinities with Putin, but I also think that Russia, through its oligarchs and through various kinds of sort of backroom deal makers, I think Russia intimidates Israel in some manner, and it doesn't want to mess more with its positionality in the Middle East than it already is facing, I think. So there's a sort of tenuous sort of geopolitical situation already in the Middle East, and Russia knows that. And Russia is known to have potential for stirring things up worse in the Middle East in neighboring countries. It intervened very heavily in Syria, for example. And I think that Israel would rightly be a little bit concerned about crossing swords with Russia at a time of belligerence. Nevertheless, Ukrainians still feel there's something more to it, and I'm not entirely sure whether there are any kind of business interests, but people feel very disappointed there, including Ukrainians who are Jewish.
Yes. So does anyone have any? Thank you for that answer, that response. Does anyone have any other questions? Yeah. Okay. There's a hand up. Okay. You have to,
Annalise.
yes, you have to
Okay,
unmute yourself.
I'll try to do that.
Oh, I
No,
did
no,
it.
no, you don't.
Can you hear
She
me?
could do it.
Oh,
yes.
okay, okay.
Well, this was just a comment. This wasn't a question, but Sharansky, Natan Sharansky, who's, lives in Israel and is Ukrainian, spoke up from a moral viewpoint very strongly, saying that he believes in Israel should stand up more strongly for Ukraine. And whether you use the word genocide or war crimes, were being committed. So to say that Israel hasn't done anything, plus they did vote in the United Nations, they
Yes.
sided with everybody. So there has been, I know Ukraine asked for more military weapons, which there haven't been. It is a question to say, but there's so many other countries as well. When you look at, it's the West that's been on the side of, Ukraine, but when you look at the rest of the Middle East, Latin America, shockingly, most of Asia has been all very neutral and said very little, other than, I guess, Japan and Australia, which we consider part of the West. Does Ukrainian society, that would be my question, feel the same way about the Latin America or the rest of the Middle East or the rest of Asia, not taking the side of Ukraine?
Well, I do want to say you were right to point out that when Israel's representative in the United Nations General Assembly voted to condemn the invasion, that was very important. But I guess Ukrainians feel like, what was it that Zelensky said? I don't need a ride. I need a gun or something like that. They're basically saying, like, we're about to lose our homeland, and we're glad that you guys feel for us. we're glad that you vote to condemn the people who illegally invaded us, despite having signed treaty after treaty honoring our sovereignty. But if we're going to respond to this thing that's been going on for 8 years, we actually need to finally end this with a show of military strength, because everything else has failed at this point. Ukrainians have been very conciliatory. Ukrainians have tried to engage in activities that also defended their territory and helped their refugees in the conflict since 2013. Now, in terms of the question about South America and Asia, as I understand it, the Kremlin has been on the major charm offensive in those world regions. I happen to sometimes look at 24-hour sort of radar of like airplanes like around Ukraine. And at the time of the beginning of the invasion, a lot of the top foreign relations leaders were in Cuba and Latin America, going around trying to line up support, a lot of the Russian leaders, because at that time, most Russian planes could no longer fly across Europe. And so it was very obvious, because they had to take this long route like over Norway and Finland. And it was a really big deal and everyone was tracking it. So those folks are like part of Kremlin sort of neo-Soviet material aid that has like a lot of strings attached to it. I think China has been a lot more effective in those world regions, probably. Russia is not nearly as potentially influential as China is, but they both have been trying to expand their geopolitical influence. And that's how I see those countries, why they take sides the way they do.
Well, that is correct. Now, I want to add something. The foreign minister of Israel also spoke up in favor of the Ukrainian people.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
the main concern of the Israelis, I think, is because the Russians are allowing the Israelis to bomb Iranian bases in Syria. And so it is a matter of life and death. I don't think it is a matter of economic interest or ideological affinity. it is that particular strategic advantage where the Russians basically allow the Israelis to bomb Iranian bases. That's all.
Oh, so it's a
But some
military.
people actually, there are a lot of discussions
Yes, yes.
inside Israel about whether they should take a more moral position. And in fact, the Russians actually recently reprimanded the Israelis for having taken some anti-Russian public positions. So, but you're right, they are not providing the weapons that they need. You know, the Israelis are not providing the weapons. That is correct. And they do it for very, very pragmatic reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say generally, I think that states take pragmatic positions. I wasn't aware of the sort of the military thing, but I assumed that it was a geopolitically based decision. Yeah. Yes.
Michael.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi there. What is your opinion on the United Nations instituting the no-fly zone, and what are the pros and cons, please?
Ukrainians, as you probably know, actually a lot of their requests for world assistance initially, especially, were requests to close the sky. And the bombing and the air raids have been terrible. And it's understandable that this would be something when people feel so desperate that they would try to ask for and demand. And sometimes doing that, making a demand, has an empowering impact. It brings solidarity. It's not realistic unless we move to the point in this war that involves other armies, and that would involve some dramatic risks of nuclear action that for reasonable reasons, many Western governments are reluctant to try that. And so I don't think it's a realistic option now. And it would also, like, as my own Ukrainian friends pointed out, not just, it's not just the it's not just the United States or Western experts that make these, logical conclusions. She said, they would have to, wouldn't they have to establish bases in Ukraine? Because you can't really do that kind of aerial defense from afar. You have to actually have the bases there, and you don't build those overnight. So even if people thought that was realistic, it would be something that would take a long time. So she thought that was not going to happen. So not even all Ukrainians thought that was realistic, even though it was a tactic that a lot of people expressed great support over, and it was a rallying cry. Personally, I don't know where this whole thing is going. And so I'm not sure how I would answer, like, whether or not no one's going to ever close the sky. What you do when you close the sky basically is you have to put one of the sides completely out of operation. Russia is trying to do that with Ukraine. And so it's understandable why Ukraine wants people to help it to not have all of its institutions destroyed. Laura.
No, Alex, you were starting to touch on that. I really enjoyed your talk very much. But what I was wondering is, as the world watches in horror, what's happening?
Yeah.
How does this end? And it's sort of like disheartening at the low possibilities and resources within the Russian populations, to overcome fear and have a stronger social movements. But also when you think about what's next, how can you have so there are such close linkages, family relationships between Ukrainians and Russians. So what's next, right, in terms of a truce and reconciliation? How can you move past a post-war dealing with what's happening with the war crimes that are happening? It's very
This
disheartening.
is a very disheartening topic, and it's a very hard one. I actually don't know what to say, but I have some hope. When people study trauma, this is a very big literature, but some of the communities that have been studied are the victims of the Holocaust, those who survived. And people do better with atrocities if they are in their own communities and they feel like they're listened to or heard. And Ukrainians are starting to develop the capacity to talk about things like that more openly. And I think that since 2013, people have really tried to create new ways of having conversations about the loss in the East and of Crimea. They've tried to reach out and they've worked, and I've talked with people who worked with refugees from that conflict, and their traumas were very significant. They'd also been under bombardment, not nearly as long as this time. And there are groups in Ukraine that have already developed art therapy methods for working with children to help them to articulate what's happening. There are art projects that are allowing children at the moment. I actually wanted to show you some of these slides, but I'm not going to, showing the way Ukrainian children are dealing with their trauma by depicting what the war is doing to their country. And all of these things are actually very important and therapeutic ways of processing. The people I would more worry about, honestly, probably are the people in Russia. There has been such an assault on all sorts of institutions in Russia that might provide spaces for people to engage in community empowerment. And a lot of those are sort of, they've been hijacked or they've been closed. Really venerable human rights groups like Memorial have been closed down. It's a very scary atmosphere. And when I think about Russia, I'm actually a lot more worried. I also think, having visited Moscow a few years ago, but after the war had already started, I was really quite shocked, and St. Petersburg, I was really quite shocked that their understanding of history was continuous with the Soviet narratives. I was so floored by that. In Ukraine, that was very unlikely among educated people. And I would even say extremely unlikely. Like, I had never come across anyone, but probably there are some people, I just haven't talked to them much, who had have not interrogated some of the, I'm going to just say it, like totalitarian propaganda about World War II. I mean, just as a basic thing, like we all have heard about Babi Yar, or Babin Yar as it is in Ukrainian. During Soviet rule, you couldn't talk about it. You couldn't do anything to commemorate the victims of Babin Yar. And people who tried to talk to eyewitnesses and survivors and tell their stories or write poetry about them, they were prevented, because who were the real victims of World War II? Not the Jews. The real victims of World War II were the Russians, according to Soviet narratives. And the perpetrators were a series of external perpetrators, including the Nazis and specifically fascists. So they were engaged in a victory over fascism there, and there's been a remarkable continuity. I'm not saying that that there aren't any institutions that are trying to challenge some of those historical narratives, but it is something that you would be very quiet about right now. It's even high on the list of these poor military people going around ransacking Ukrainian cities and towns. They're destroying Ukrainian history books and textbooks. Like, at a time like this, the Russian state media, one of their top obsessions, one of their top things that they talk about, as much as we talk about like the atrocities that happened, they talk about, like, this is what they say in Ukrainian school books about Ukrainian history being distinct, that there is like a difference between Ukraine and Russia. And they talk about this as if it's an atrocity. And I just want to say a lot of the people who are saying these things are also involved in like all sorts of other anti-Western discourse, even though their own children have like moved to very cushy lives in places like London or New York, where they are very much part of Western culture. So this is a very complex thing where there's a propaganda machine of just mammoth proportions. And all of the people who have tried to articulate like grassroots voices have just been slammed down over and over. It's very sad.
Terrific. Laura, thank you for that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you very much. Thank you for all of the questions. These are
everyone was terrific. This was great. I just wanted to first thank you for sharing your expertise and experience and giving us so much time. This was without a doubt an excellent webinar, excellent. And we thank you so much. For those who came late, the Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research is a nonpartisan public policy organization, a research center, and a think tank. We are a 501c3. Please visit our website at palmbeachdemocracy.org and click on the donation button. Your tax-deductible donation will allow us to build an even stronger presence here in Florida, the US, and throughout the world. And with that, I once again thank you and thank everyone in attendance. And with that, good evening, good night, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all
Thank
for
you.
coming, and thank you, Luis, for thinking of me.
No, thank you. It was really exciting and was really, really enlightening.
Thank you.
Alexandra,
Yes.
congratulations.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
night.
Good night,
Bye.
Luis, stay on. Nadeska, please stay on. Okay, good night, everyone.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.